You know, for 2,000 years, we've been told a pretty simple story. The Jews rejected Jesus. But what if that's not the whole story? Not even close. What if the first and most violent enemies of early Christianity were someone else entirely? All right, let's dig into this fascinating source material because it uncovers a story that's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. So let's just start with the big question. If I asked you to name the main group that opposed Jesus and his followers right at the very beginning, who would you say? Yeah, for most people, the answer that just pops into your head is the Jews. It's a simple, straightforward narrative that's been passed down for centuries. But the source material we're looking at today says, hold on, not so fast. In fact, it argues that the real antagonists weren't devout Jews trying to protect their faith at all. They were a powerful, skeptical elite who just so happened to be running Judaism's most sacred institution. They were, in a way, the very last people you'd ever suspect. Which brings us to our first key group. And these villains weren't dressed in armor, carrying swords. No, they were dressed in the holy robes of the highest priests in the land. So let's meet the Sadducees. On the surface, they're the ruling priestly class, the folks in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. But here's the absolute kicker. According to this source, they were basically philosophical materialists. I mean, they didn't believe in the resurrection, or angels, or spirits, or even that God really intervened in the world. How wild is that? The very people in charge of God's house didn't seem to believe in the most supernatural parts of the faith it represented. And you can see just how massive this split was. This wasn't some minor disagreement. On one side, you've got the Sadducees saying, death is the end, God's not involved. And on the other, you've got traditional Jewish faith, which is built on the idea of resurrection and a God who is deeply, personally active in history. It was a complete clash of worldviews happening right at the center of the faith. And this gets right to the core of the conflict. With this quote, Jesus is basically saying their opposition wasn't coming from a place of ignorance. It's not that they didn't know. No, they had seen undeniable, supernatural proof, miracles that no one else could do. But their commitment to their materialist philosophy was so rigid, they chose to just hate the evidence that was staring them right in the face. And, this willingness to attack people who believed in a supernatural God, this wasn't a new thing. The source shows it was part of a long and often pretty violent historical pattern. Let's just quickly trace this, right? You start with the Maccabees, these heroes fighting for their supernatural faith. But just a generation later, their own descendants are allying with the Sadducees and embracing materialism. And this shift leads to real violence, like the murder of Honi the circle drawer, a holy man who was killed simply because he refused to use his prayers as a political weapon for them. A very dangerous precedent was being set. Now, fast forward to the book of Acts, and we see this pattern just explode. It escalates from arguments and arrests into a full-blown campaign of martyrdom. So here's the crucial thing to understand. When the apostles start performing miracles and attracting thousands of followers, for the Sadducees, this was way more than just a nuisance. Every single miracle was a direct assault on their entire belief system. It was living proof that God was involved, that the supernatural was real, and that their whole materialist worldview was just wrong. It was, as the source puts it, ideologically catastrophic. And this all just boils over with Stephen. He stands up in front of the council and connects all the dots for them. He straight up accuses them of being part of a long, corrupt line of leaders who resist God and murder his prophets. He's not just having a theological debate here. He is reading their criminal record out loud in public. And wow, their reaction tells you everything you need to know. The source argues this wasn't the righteous anger of people whose faith had been insulted. No way. This was the white-hot fury of guilty men who had just been unmasked in front of everybody. Their violence wasn't about protecting God, it was about silencing the witness. So all this tension, all this conflict, is just barreling towards one single dramatic moment, a final breaking point that's going to seal their fate and set the stage for a really tragic future. So get this. In 62 CE, the leadership tries this new tactic. They put James, Jesus' brother, up on a high point of the temple, thinking he'll calm the crowds and discredit the whole movement. But the plan backfires spectacularly. James instead proclaims that Jesus is divine, and the crowd just erupts with shouts of praise. And in that moment of pure panic, having lost total control, the leaders do the unthinkable. They throw James from the wall to his death. And that single, desperate act perfectly captures the ultimate tragic irony at the heart of this entire story.
It's a complete and total role reversal from where this whole dynasty started.
And this right here is the core thesis of the whole book. You have the Jewish Christians, the Ha-Notzrim. They embodied everything the original Maccabean heroes died for: a supernatural faith, religious purity, a belief in a God who acts. And then you have the Sadducees, the actual descendants of those heroes, and they had become everything their ancestors fought against: materialist, politically corrupt collaborators. They had traded their spiritual heritage for Greek philosophy. So what does this all mean? What's the big takeaway? Well, this whole reframing leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. What if the biggest fault lines in history aren't always between one religion and another? What if, as this story suggests, the most fundamental conflict of all is actually between those who believe in something beyond what we can see and those who don't?